the help he needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Today, the Halifax Chronicle-Herald revealed a staggering erosion of services at Valley Regional Hospital, and I will table. The surgical wait lists have extended beyond 3,000 surgeries. Within that number, urology surgeries have a wait list of more than 900, and orthopedic surgeries have a wait list of greater than 1,300. Is yet another example of how this government has failed to tackle the crisis in health care. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, what does the Premier have to say to the people of Annapolis and Kings counties who are facing unacceptable wait times due to the neglect of his government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as he would know, more recently, outside of the Memorandum of Understanding with physicians, we put another $40 million in to deal with the issues of support around offices and pay to docs. We're continuing at the negotiating table right now. You would also know that last year alone, we put an additional $9 million in when it comes to orthopedic wait times. That's $24 million in addition to what's already been put on over the last number of years. But we, want to continue to see improvements in wait times, and we'll continue to work with our service providers to best deliver that outcome.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Premier for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, patients from Yarmouth and South Shore are often transferred to Valley Regional despite having their own regional hospitals. This is particularly true for orthopedic surgeries, but also for other surgeries. Valley Regional has outlined a clear need for an additional 50 beds and 3 surgery suites. This would be a first step to clearing some of the backlog. The Premier likes to talk at length about his deep pocket plan for capital spending in Halifax and less is more plans for hospitals in Cape Breton. Meanwhile, the Valley drowns in the need for surgeries. My question, Mr. Speaker, is does the Premier have a plan that will give Valley Regional the facilities that it needs?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We continue to invest in healthcare infrastructure across the province, including the Valley. Mr. Speaker, been at the Valley Regional. The hospice is ongoing. Mr. Speaker, one of the issues that is not in his preamble that is a challenge is anesthesia. Mr. Speaker, not only impacts the Valley, it's impacting other parts of the province. That in itself impacts OR time, the surgeries that are taking place, Mr. Speaker. So it is not just the fact that we continue to make those investments, providing more OR time, more operations. We need to make sure that we have the entire disciplinary team that can actually carry out those surgeries.
The honourable leader for the New Democratic Party.
Last week, Mr. Speaker, Statistics Canada reported that median incomes in Nova Scotia are the lowest, 10th out of 10, dead last in the entire country. Now, last month I heard the Premier in his State of the Province comments say that in his view we are economically on the right path, the right road in Nova Scotia. So I want to simply ask the Premier, how can a province possibly be on the right economic road when it has, as we have, the lowest incomes in the entire country?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We've continued to make investments, Mr. Speaker, those most vulnerable in our populations when we ensure we're leaving more money in the pockets of low-income Nova Scotians by adjusting basic personal exemption, weighted heavily for those who need the support the most. Continue to make transformational change that's going to take place, income assistance, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, working with the private sector employers to ensure that university and community college graduates get their first job opportunity in this province. We're supporting that in wage support. Continuing to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to grow the private sector in the province. Continue to make sure at the same time we're investing in public services. He would know we've had a substantial number of increase in the public sector wage sector that we believe were affordable, but yet they were still being increased. All of those, Mr. Speaker, will take time to continue to allow the economy of the province to grow. And I look forward to continuing to see more people choose to stay and live and work in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, what the Premier is failing to square up to in this response is the government's comparative economic performance. So since the current government began its mandate, median incomes across Canada have risen by 6%. But in this same period, median incomes have risen in Nova Scotia by 0%, 0.2%. So I want to ask the Premier, does he not register some sense of dismay or register some sense of alarm that Canadians in the rest of the country outside of Nova Scotia have seen income increases fare 30 times greater than ours have been in the period that the Liberals have been in power?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he would know, Mr. Speaker, there's been many challenges facing this province. There's been structural challenges for successive decades when it comes to delivering services in Nova Scotia. We've been outstripping our growth to continue to deliver those services. We had some difficult decisions to make when we came into power, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we were being able to pay as we go. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing positive signs in the incomes of Nova Scotians. We're also very encouraged by the fact that, Mr. Speaker, we're starting to see that all-important cohort of 18 to 34-year-old population starting to grow in Nova Scotia's third consecutive year. We've retained more young people than we've lost. All of that, Mr. Speaker, they recognize that this province is moving in the right direction, that we continue to see that growth, and they want to be part of it, and they want to live here. Not only do they want to work here, Mr. Speaker, they want to live and raise their families here.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has cited a great many different considerations, but none of these considerations changes the fact that incomes in Nova Scotia are as flat today as yesterday's Shrove Tuesday pancakes. Now look, the Conference Board of Canada has identified weak consumer demand as a key thing inhibiting economic growth in this province. So I want to ask the Premier, how are we going to improve consumer demand when we've got the lowest incomes in Canada?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, he would know if he looks forward, Mr. Speaker, the wage growth in this province is keeping pace at with the national agenda, Mr. Speaker. He would also know when he uses a national number, there are certain provinces through resource development, Mr. Speaker, that have seen huge growth. We have seen, quite frankly, a record year when it comes to exporting opportunities and getting the proper price for our products, Mr. Speaker, for after successive decades when people would continue to sole source one market. Mr. Speaker, take $5 a pound for lobster in December was unacceptable to us. We came to power. All of that growth in the price of lobsters turning around, being spun around, and deckhands, Mr. Speaker, fish operators, those are all positive signs. But I want to tell the Honourable Member, it takes time to continue to move this province out of the direction it had been going under successive governments in this now positive way, in a direction that allows us, Mr. Speaker, to not only see a future of those of us that live here, but we see young people, Mr. Speaker, who are really showing the real confidence, Mr. Speaker, by choosing to live, stay, and work here.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Valley Regional's problems are not limited to a lack of facilities. They continue to combat the all too familiar problem of a lack of doctors, in this case, anesthesiologists. In the fall, the Valley Regional Hospital lost one full-time and one part-time anesthesiologist. Without sufficient coverage by anesthesiologists, surgery simply cannot go ahead. What we have is a choke point in the system that has a cascading effect. So my question is, within the NSHA's doctor recruitment strategy, is priority given to those specialties like anesthesiologists who are vital to the patient flow?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for this question. Indeed, recruitment and priorities of recruiting the appropriate healthcare professionals is a priority for government as well as the Nova Scotia Health Authority. As the member, Mr. Speaker, and I think others would be aware, indeed, looking at what the needs of the system are do play a role in identifying the priority of the recruitment. But when there's a vacancy, Mr. Speaker, the recruiters are out there engaging, promoting up those opportunities and looking to fill them as soon as possible.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Dr. Davidson is quoted in the article that was tabled earlier by my colleague saying that the lack of anesthesiologists will result in patients actually losing limbs and even dying because surgeries cannot be performed. His words, not mine. Chief anesthesiologist Robert Doyle states that each lost doctor reduces the hospital surgical capacity by 20%. And it's leading those that remain toward a burnout state of feeling. We've tried to talk about this at the Health Committee, but the majority on that committee will not let us talk about it. They refuse. I can't, for the life of me, understand why the government won't talk about the working conditions of its most sacred and scarce profession. So why is the government refusing to listen to the concerns of our doctors in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess in response to the member's question, the fact of the matter is we do listen to physicians. You know, talking about the work being done, for example, the member's talking about surgical capacity and surgical work. We listen to doctors, and about a little over a year ago, orthopedic team came together to produce a plan for the Nova Scotia Health Authority, brought to the government to address wait times and improve our capacity in the delivery of orthopedic surgeries, Mr. Speaker. We accepted that plan that was developed by doctors, presented to us. We listened to them, and we've taken action. We've hired more orthosurgeons. We've hired more anesthesiologists as part of that plan, Mr. Speaker, and that's listening to doctors and implementing those plans to improve care for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Over the course of the past 5 years, the number of visits made to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital emergency room by patients without a family doctor have more than doubled. Since 2011, the number of patients leaving the regional without being seen has jumped by 34%, with almost 1 in every 10 patients leaving without being seen by a doctor in 2018, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, does he agree that these numbers indicate that the crisis in primary care is a major contributor to overcrowded emergency rooms?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I've spoken here in the legislature before, indicating that, in fact, we do believe, and I do believe, that strengthening access to primary care is one of the tasks needed to be done in order to reduce pressures on our emergency departments. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in recruitment of physicians, strengthening our collaborative practice teams. The member raises questions about Cape Breton, where we've recruited 8 new family physicians and 7 new specialists, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
4 of those new doctors, Mr. Speaker, came through the immigration physician stream, which was implemented just about a year ago with my colleague, the Minister of Immigration. So, Mr. Speaker, we do take primary care seriously. We do believe that's an important part of our overall healthcare system and help reduce the pressures on our emergency departments.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, over the course of the past few years, the Minister and the Premier both have responded to concerns about primary care in Cape Breton by pointing to the low rate of people on the family doctor list. Their argument, as I understand it, is that Cape Breton has one of the lowest subscription rates to the list and there's nothing to worry about. However, as we've learned this week, other numbers tell a different story. Last night, it was reported that 20 doctors are withdrawing from providing inpatient care at our community hospitals because their compensation makes keeping a family practice open at the same time unsustainable. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, why is he closing community hospitals in Cape Breton that also provide primary care when the need for more family doctors is so high?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I think what the member was referring to is our investment in primary care infrastructure for Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
That, Mr. Speaker, is investment in primary care facilities in those communities, Mr. Speaker. It's an investment in our emergency facilities in Cape Breton Regional and the
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
and Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker, and supporting those family practice teams, Mr. Speaker, include hiring 25 new health professionals in Cape Breton over the last 2 years to strengthen those collaborative practices. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Earlier this year, I visited addiction treatment centres in Cape Breton. While I was happy to see the great work being done to help people recover from addiction, I was sad to see the massive lineups of people at pharmacies waiting to get methadone. Withdrawals from substance abuse can be fatal, but people of Cape Breton deserve treatment for their addiction, not just to have one addiction replaced with another. My question for the Minister is this. With the increase of people being put on methadone, are counselling and treatment services for these individuals being increased as well?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member raises a very important topic as it relates to opioid use disorders. Mr. Speaker, a challenge facing much of the country, and Nova Scotia is not immune. That's why one of the first programs that I announced when I came in 2017 as a health minister was our opioid overdose response framework, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of factors to that, but one of them is the expansion of treatment options. And Mr. Speaker, in the last year, based upon our investments and expansion of treatment options, we've reduced the wait list by almost or just over 90%, Mr. Speaker, from over 200 people waiting to about 20 on the list as of February.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, while in Cape Breton, I was told that it costs 22 cents to make a dose of methadone, but the pharmacies sell it for $10 apiece. More and more people are being put on methadone, and it's creating serious dependency issues in our communities. And apparently a black market is being created by people taking their methadone, going out back, throwing up, and selling that to someone else. My question for the Minister is, will the Minister tell the House what is being done to prevent methadone from becoming just another street drug?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my understanding that the methadone treatments do, and I'll verify this for the member, but that methadone is to be taken in front of or with the treatment people, Mr. Speaker. So Mr. Speaker, steps are taken to ensure that the product, the treatment, is consumed in front of healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker. So again, based upon the treatment protocols and standards, that would be the process for delivery of that drug treatment that would be followed in Nova Scotia like other parts of the country.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
My question is to the Minister of Health as well. In 2008, our party, while in government, passed legislation that clearly defined the requirements necessary to be classified as a counselling therapist in Nova Scotia. One of the requirements, among others, was that applicants had to have a master's degree in order to register with the college. And recently, other provinces have been shifting from educational requirements for licensure to competency requirements. So my question to the Minister of Health is, will he commit to maintaining the current qualifications to call yourself a counselling therapist?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member raises an important question around the regulation of healthcare professionals, and indeed, as healthcare professionals, the self-regulation aspect of that. So, at this point in time, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of changes to that qualification standard within the college, Mr. Speaker. So, there's certainly nothing on my agenda that I've seen that would suggest that there'd be any changes coming.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
So the Canadian Free Trade Agreement allows people to transfer between provinces to work. Because qualifications vary from province to province, we're at risk of having people who have the equivalent of a diploma coming here and calling themselves counselling therapists. It would be the equivalent to taking a 2-year nursing course, moving to another provinces, and calling yourself a registered nurse. Counselling therapists are responsible for treating people with serious mental illness, and their college has been told by the department to prepare to accept those people who are less qualified. just because they call themselves a counseling therapist. My question again to the minister is, will he commit to maintaining the high standard it takes to be considered a counseling therapist in Nova Scotia for the safety of our patients?
Just before we move on to the minister's answer, I want to remind the members of the audience in the gallery here that it's not proper to participate in the proceedings by showing pleasure or displeasure, so I'll ask you to refrain from showing either side there. So the Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I do assure the member is that indeed, when it comes to all of our healthcare professionals and the regulatory oversight that takes place, it is important, and in fact, the public interest, as the member referenced, is the primary objective of ensuring and maintaining that public interest. So I do commit, whether it's with counselling therapists or other regulated professions, Mr. Speaker, that the public interest will remain top and foremost in any legislation and regulations governing those entities.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. In 2013, go-to teachers were identified and trained across the province to help students navigate the mental health system. This one-day training that didn't even include mental health first aid was meant to be enough to prepare teachers to deal with everything from mild depression to suicidal thoughts. Mr. Speaker, bullying in our schools is rampant. Students are having suicidal thoughts, and this government thinks that one day of training is enough. My question to the minister is, what additional training is being provided to teachers to be prepared to handle student mental health issues?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just one correction for the member. We are seeing the global number of bullying incidents decrease in our province, which I think is a positive thing that we should celebrate. But mental health is always a challenge. Professional development for teachers is ongoing. There's funding available for that. We have particular funding on areas related to inclusive education as well. But further to that, we also want to have wraparound supports for our students. So we've brought in child and youth care practitioners, behavioral experts, autism experts. We've also brought in the Schools Plus program, all designed to better provide mental health supports, well-being supports to our students, Mr. Speaker. And while we know we have not fixed all the challenges in the education system, we are seeing progress, and the feedback that we are getting from the front lines has been generally positive.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for the response. I'd like to ask the minister to table the stats for the bullying incidents going down, because I can't seem to find those anywhere. The go-to training was designed for the certain teachers that students would naturally turn to for help. Go-to training didn't provide educators with any additional way of bypassing wait lists or accessing additional programs or services. This training took educators who had good relationships with students, gave them one day of training, and made them responsible for helping students with severe mental health crises as they sit on endless wait lists. My question to the minister is, given this additional responsibility and stress that we have put on the educators, what service does the government provide for educators to protect their own mental health?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These numbers have been reported publicly. I've done media interviews on them as well, and we can make sure that the member gets those, the data on mental health. We have increased supports in our schools. We've brought in non-teaching supports for the first time in education. Schools Plus is designed to help get students to the areas of government service where those services are needed, whether it's mental health, an issue at home that involves justice, or community services. And that is all intended to pull some of the pressure off of our educators and to have these non-teaching supports in place, Mr. Speaker. So still a lot of work to do. We know there's still issues with bullying. One incident is too many. And we're going to keep doing our very best to ensure that those non-teaching specialized supports are in place to help students with mental health, behavior issues, emotional issues, and make sure we have that wraparound support in our schools that we know our kids need.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, the department's promise to cut wait times for hip and knee replacement surgeries without adding additional resources has put the surgical department at the Valley Regional Hospital in serious jeopardy. 7 months after the province announced the program, Chief Anesthesiologist Dr. Robert Doyle and 23 of his colleagues at the hospital wrote a letter calling for a halt to the initiative at the hospital, saying it had led to the deterioration of overall care at the facility. The program put, and I quote, unacceptable additional pressure on an overburdened and under-capacity infrastructure and staff. Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister admit that it was irresponsible to push forward with such an ambitious program without providing adequate resources to support it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd encourage the member to go back to just over a year ago in the fall of 17 when we announced this initiative for increasing the access to orthopedic surgeries. That announcement, we were very clear, Mr. Speaker, that the proposal that came forward was one that was developed by the healthcare professionals, the surgeons themselves that have come forward to us with a proposal. I'd like to clarify the record to Mr. Speaker and the members' remarks that we didn't include additional resources. In fact, we did. We hired 4 additional orthopedic surgeons as well as 4 anaesthetists, Mr. Speaker, to support that work. And on top of that, there are a number of other ancillary support health professionals like physiotherapy and other services that were brought on stream to help move forward with this. So in fact, we did invest based upon the program that was designed and brought to us by healthcare professionals on the front line.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that is out of the words of 24 healthcare professionals at the Valley Regional that are looking for support. Mr. Speaker, while hip and knee wait times absolutely need to be dealt with, they cannot be dealt with at the expense of people's lives. They need to be properly funded. The pressure that the minister's goal put on the Valley Regional Hospital has had dire consequences. Dr. Dion Davidson, a vascular surgeon at the hospital, said that as a result of the shortage of anesthesiologists, surgical time has been cut, and that as a consequence, people who needed surgeries have died before they could receive the surgery. Mr. Speaker, will the minister please tell this House why he pushed recklessly forward with this plan when medical staff at the Valley Regional Hospital alerted him and told him of the danger?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it unfortunate that the categorization of a recommendation that was brought forward from frontline healthcare professionals through the Nova Scotia Health Authority to the department, which included increased resource allocation, which meant millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, being invested to hire additional specialists and support providers and other healthcare professions to support this initiative. Mr. Speaker, this was a well-planned and financially supported program that was rolled out across the province so that these additional orthopedic surgeries, Mr. Speaker, are available across the province. And indeed, where there are wait lists, Mr. Speaker, people can request a referral to another part of the province with a shorter wait list so that we can actually stabilize and balance out the delivery of orthopedic surgeries from one end of the province to the other.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Advanced Education. In order to graduate with a Bachelor of Education, there are a number of requirements. Something that is not required is to take either a first aid course or a mental health first aid course. Educators are responsible for keeping our students safe, and without proper training, that's a daunting task. Does the Minister feel that mental health training would be a valuable asset for teachers?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. I do believe that mental health training as well as first aid training would be valuable for our teachers in the public school system. I think those are skills that would help them deliver education to our students, and it would be a great benefit to the students as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
That's how you answer yes, Mr. Speaker. Mental health first aid helps to identify the red flags, the warning signs of any underlying mental health issues. In a world where cyberbullying continues to spread and more students suffer in silence, identifying these warning signs are important as ever. Ensuring all educators in the province are trained to identify mental health issues quickly become a difference between life and death for a student who is being cyberbullied. My question to the minister my question for the Minister of Advanced Education, is he willing to work with universities to make mental health aid mandatory for bachelor education? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will pass this question on to the Minister of Education. It is the Department of Education that sets the criteria for teachers, but in terms of whatever they're looking for, I'm more than happy to work with the department and our universities to bring it forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very timely that this conversation happens in the legislature because we do have a steering committee that's working with our BED providers to look at the curriculum, identify the additional needs that we have from a training perspective to deal with the complexities in the classroom, mental health, and other supports as well. So the advice from the member is pertinent. These conversations are ongoing, and I look forward to informing the member in the House the changes that are made to our BED programs to help our teachers better meet the needs of the system and the students.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for over 30 years in the north end of Dartmouth, a dedicated team at the Freedom Foundation have been helping men transition from a life of addiction to a life of sober independence. Hundreds of men have gotten back on their feet because of the work at the Freedom Foundation and their programming. Graduating from this program doesn't just mean recovering from addiction, it means developing skills, independence, and a sense of ownership again over your life. Over the last 30 years, Mr. Speaker, every single provincial minister of health has visited the Freedom Foundation to see the incredible work they do there. My question for our Minister of Health is, has he visited the Freedom Foundation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, I have not been over to visit the Freedom Foundation, but I have, Mr. Speaker, learned about the services that are provided by them, as I have with other service providers that are operating in communities across this great province.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Freedom Foundation is funded primarily through the Department of Health. They say that they need an additional $10 a day increase to their funding to be able to run the programs that they need. For 10 years, this funding they currently receive hasn't changed. After visiting, you can clearly see firsthand how important the programming is and how far an additional $10 a day would actually go for the foundation. My question, all that being said, for the minister, knowing how much the province invests into this program and their repeated requests for a visit from the minister, why hasn't he visited the foundation, and would he be willing to?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I have the opportunity to get out to communities throughout the province, I do meet with and visit a wide range of service providers. Some of them are our partners, like the sites for our health authorities, and others are community-based organizations. I do my best to get around and get out to see as many as possible, and Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to include this organization within the groups that I would get out to visit in my next opportunity to get out in that part of the province here in Central.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, for years, transition programs like Freedom Foundation and Talbot House have been operating abstinence-free based programs for people recovering from addictions. These programs have a zero tolerance rate in place for alcohol or drug use. As methadone grows in popularity as a treatment for addiction, these programs are facing increasing pressure from the Nova Scotia Health Authority to switch from abstinence-based to methadone-based programming. My question to the Minister is quite simple. Is the department going to force abstinence-based treatment programs to switch to methadone-based in order to continue receiving government funding?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've never heard a proposal like that come forward, or haven't seen a proposal like that come forward. But what I can advise the members in my engagement with a special focus on mental health and addictions, Mr. Speaker, as I went around and stopped at various sites to talk with mental health and addictions frontline staff, and I asked them about treatments and the changes, because we did bring mental health and addictions departments together as a team rather than where they previously operated separately. And one of the things that they had highlighted, Mr. Speaker, and I can perhaps delve deeper in the other response, is that there are changing clinical guidelines around best practices for treatment of addiction-based conditions.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And for the minister's benefit, the answer was no. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of people have graduated from the abstinence-based recovery programs like Freedom Foundation and Talbot House. Graduating from these programs requires constant support and determination. The graduation numbers prove that the innovative work being done by these programs truly does work for these clients. Mr. Speaker, with this proven track record of success of abstinence-based addiction recovery programs, will the minister commit to allowing these programs to continue without being forced to add methadone into their programs?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is raising questions of a clinical nature as to what the best practices are for the delivery of clinical treatments, Mr. Speaker. What I can assure the member and all members of the House, and indeed all Nova Scotians, is that we will be guided by the best clinical advice and evidence that we have when governing the treatment programs and the delivery of those programs in the province, Mr. Speaker. I think that's an important thing for members to keep in mind, is when raising questions of a clinical nature, that we do, I think, take the lead from clinicians who know what the appropriate best practices would be.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Truvada is a drug used in the treatment of HIV. Individuals diagnosed with HIV are eligible for full coverage of this medication. Recent research has shown that when taken daily as PrEP, the drug is 98% effective for the prevention of sexual transmission of HIV and 70% effective for the prevention of drug injection transmission of HIV. Evidence from other jurisdictions have shown that universal coverage results in significant decline in new HIV diagnoses. British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan all provide universal coverage for PrEP. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Health agree to include universal coverage for PrEP in the upcoming budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising this important question. As members of the legislature may be aware, the province began covering PrEP as part of our formulary earlier this year, as part of our pharmacare programs. Mr. Speaker, as part of that announcement, one of the commitments we made was to engage in continued consultations to look at what else, other types of work, and what role further coverage may include. So, Mr. Speaker, that work has been ongoing with our, I believe, our primary health care team, Mr. Speaker. As far as what's in the upcoming budget, I think the member can wait a couple more weeks.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
I can't, Mr. Speaker. I need to know now. Mr. Speaker, as of June 2018, Nova Scotia had 16 new HIV infections, double the expected numbers. Members of the PrEP Action Team have said that adding PrEP coverage through family pharmacare will have little to no impact on HIV rates in Nova Scotia, since many who would benefit from PrEP will not be able to afford the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in co-pays required before provincial support kicks in. Mr. Speaker, universal coverage for PrEP would require a $1.5 million annual investment. This is just over the lifetime cost of HIV-related health care for one person. Mr. Speaker, does the minister agree it would make better sense and better investment in preventative medicine than to continue to pay the cost of rising infection rates?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member raised a very important piece of information for this legislature. For the members that aren't aware, with the increased number of HIV infections that we've seen in this past year, the vast majority of the increase has been seen actually in the area of drug use transmissions, Mr. Speaker. That raises another very important question and challenge that we face. It goes back to our commitment and our efforts, Mr. Speaker, to provide more treatment options as well within the drugs addiction space to help reduce those and avoid some of those other risk factors that are at play to avoid those increased transmissions and infections.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health as well. Mr. Speaker, according to the Mental Health Act, a person cannot be involuntarily admitted for care unless they are a danger to themselves or someone else. This creates problems for people who have family members who are living with severe mental illness but aren't considered a danger yet. Family members are unable to provide their loved ones with the intensive care that they need, and it leaves them feeling helpless. So my question to the Minister of Health is, what resources are available to get help for someone who needs it but is not considered a danger?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member noted, the key distinction there is involuntary admittance to the care. Mr. Speaker, just like other health treatments, the healthcare system can't force treatments on individuals who have the capacity to make those healthcare decisions for themselves. With respect to what types of services are available to individuals with mental health conditions, they include obviously services offered by the Nova Scotia Health Authority and other community-based partners that are available throughout the province. Obviously, crisis lines are available, Mr. Speaker, to help perform online assessments and other treatments that I can certainly engage with the member further if you're so inclined.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a constituent whose son is homeless as a result of his severe mental illness. He was admitted to the hospital but was released a few short days later because he wasn't deemed to need long-term intensive care. His illness caused him to lose his home, children, vehicle, and any sort of income. He was admitted to the hospital because he had nearly frozen and starved to death, Mr. Speaker. If that isn't someone who needs intensive care, I don't know who is. So my question to the Minister, when someone is admitted to the hospital under the Mental Health Act, is their safety and their best interest considered contributing factors as to when they get discharged?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly when evaluating patients, again, and their suitability for discharge from a hospital system, whether from a physical ailment or a mental health one. Indeed, the clinicians who are making those discharge decisions have the clinical expertise and the intimate knowledge of the individual patients, as well as what their clinical needs may be, what needs would require the hospital services, and what may be required when they're discharged, Mr. Speaker. So all of those components do come into play as those clinicians who are approving the discharge and discharge plan make those decisions and sign the discharge papers.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, so far this session, every time the Minister of Health or Premier have been asked about ambulance shortages, they've been bragging about the new offload program at the Dartmouth General. Now, the offload program might be helping avoid backups, but it isn't helping anyone in Dartmouth in a mental health crisis. As the only regional hospital in the province without emergency mental health services, if you show up at the Dartmouth General with suicidal thoughts, you're put in a taxi and sent to the QE2. Now, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health is this. Do the taxis get to use the ambulance door, or do they have to use the main entrance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing for the member to realize is that as a single health authority, the teams within the various facilities across the province do just that. They work together as teams providing services to meet the healthcare needs of all Nova Scotians. So the important thing, I think, for the member and his constituents to be aware of is that the health authority and the system are working together to ensure that the individuals get the care and the treatment that they need, whether it be for physical or mental health conditions.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, when the Auditor General called this government out on their lack of a mental health plan, the minister said that, quote, 911 is always available. Now, the people of Dartmouth are better off calling Bob's Taxi than 911 in order to get to the hospital that actually has the services they need. Mr. Speaker, the Dartmouth General is in the middle of a multi-million-dollar renovation. The staff of the Dartmouth General expected these services to be added. The residents of Dartmouth expected these services to be added. My question is this. Does the minister believe that the people of Dartmouth don't experience mental health emergencies? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member drawing attention to the ongoing investment and expansion of services being provided to the Dartmouth General Hospital, Mr. Speaker, including inpatient beds and surgical suites as part of the overall QE2 New Generation Redevelopment Project. Mr. Speaker, I assure the member and his constituents that indeed Dartmouth is a critical piece of the healthcare delivery for the province and the central zone. And of course, Mr. Speaker, like any Nova Scotian, really any Nova Scotian, mental illness does not discriminate. Indeed, no matter where you reside, no matter your social status, Mr. Speaker, we certainly acknowledge and recognize that any Nova Scotian could be afflicted by a mental illness.
The honourable member for Northside, Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just heard the minister say that mental health illness doesn't matter where you reside, but it does matter where you reside if you're looking for treatment in a local hospital that is closed. Mr. Speaker, a recent article in the Montreal Gazette that I'll table outlines the immediate action Concordia University took after the first ever student suicide on campus. It took one suicide for Concordia to implement stronger mental health services and supports. A single death sent the staff in immediate action, and they're now leading the way on how we should respond to suicide. My question to the Minister of Health is, how many suicides will it take in Nova Scotia for the government to take action and improve mental health services?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, our government very clearly, under the leadership of the Premier, Mr. Speaker, my mandate letter makes it abundantly clear that one of my top priorities and in my mandate is the investment and expansion of mental health services for the province. We take this area of the healthcare system very seriously. It's one that I take seriously not just because it's in a mandate letter, Mr. Speaker. It's one that I take seriously because because it affects all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Northside, Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, universities in this province and universities across Canada have something in common. They both have been grappling with rising demands and better mental health supports for years. Concordia has set the standard for mental health supports. The response to suicide shouldn't be the exception, it should be the rule. So I'll ask the Minister of Education, or Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education implement the same type of program in universities in Nova Scotia that Concordia University is looking into?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, with great success, Acadia University launched a peer-to-peer mental health support program as a pilot project, and what they found was the wait time for students decreased dramatically because the interventions were there before any smaller anxieties could become more serious for the students. Because of the success of this program, we actually invested in last year's budget over $500,000 and rolled this program out to all universities. And Mr. Speaker, so far the results coming back have been very positive. Before rolling it out, we did have it peer reviewed from professionals. And Mr. Speaker, everything has been positive, and I look forward to the support to the universities and to our students ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to add 30 seconds to question period. So the honourable member for Truro, Millbrook, Bible Hill, Salmon River.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to ask a question today about the Alton Gas Treaty Truck House. The minister has left things in the air so much that there are now injunctions instead of consultations with our First Nations people. Is this really the path to reconciliation, Mr. Speaker? Is this really the way of we are all treaty people? I think not. Does the minister commit today that this project will not go ahead before the province adequately consults Siboneygadig First Nations?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member
time allotted for oral questions.